Thanks, Chris. That's the best welcome I've ever had anywhere. Chris said this had better be good, so probably the best way of making it good is to upfront plug GRDC. The fact that this is all funded by GRDC Research and through the National Water Use Efficiency Initiative, so long-term farming systems experiments, 5 years, and highly collaborative between Neil Fattel at Condobolin, FarmLink Research in southwest New South Wales, and Southern Farming Systems in southwest Victoria, and the Birchip Cropping Group, and also with some NAMI funding, which Haram chipped in. Thanks, Haram. With that in mind, I'll rip into it and I'll put the take-home messages up front. The most important thing for getting the best value out of current varieties and maximising whole farm yield is to know the optimal flowering date in your variety, in your environment, and how to achieve it from a broad range of sowing dates with different varieties, from winter wheats right through to short season springs. In our experiments, we've demonstrated that slow maturing varieties sown early have a yield advantage over mid-fast varieties sown later to the tune of 0.8 of a tonne per hectare, and that including such a variety in your sowing program can drastically increase average farm wheat yield because you're opening up the sowing window, giving yourself more opportunities to plant crop, and more crop goes in on time, not only of the slow maturing variety, but because you're getting some paddocks out of the road early, more of your main season variety goes in on time as well. And across all our trials, except for one or two, which I'll show you, the yield penalty from sowing later than optimal is always greater than sowing earlier than optimal, even when we have frost damage. Yet, at the moment, the majority of farmers start sowing varieties on their optimal date and then work into suboptimal territory. And even breeding companies will often give a sowing window where the first date mentioned is the optimal date. And across our trials, the highest yields in the time of sowing components of them have always had about 5 to 10% frost damage. Okay, so where did all this research come from? It essentially came out of the first few years of the National Water Use Efficiency Initiative, where we were doing a lot of work on summer fallow management, trying to capture more out-of-season rainfall and make it available to the crop, which is obviously something that's very widely practiced these days. And what we found was that when you did that, the optimal sowing time changed. When you have stored soil water, the optimal sowing time moves. So this is yield profit sowing opportunity reports for the Southern Mallee for the variety Yitpi. When you have no stored soil water prior to sowing, the optimal sowing date is about the middle of May. When you have 50 millimetres of plant available water, your optimal sowing date moves back to the end of April, start of May. So you've shifted about 2 weeks and obviously increased your yield potential. So when you've got stored soil water, you actually have a greater yield penalty from delayed sowing. But what you also notice is that the frost risk profile doesn't really change. So even though the optimal dates move back, you are incurring an extra frost risk, and maybe that isn't worth the while. So our question was, well, can we capture the benefit of that stored soil water by sowing a long season wheat earlier and then manage the frost risk by using a longer season wheat instead of the normal mid-fast variety that we might have otherwise used? And by doing that, we not only be able to take advantage of stored soil water, but we can widen our sowing window to take advantage of any opportunity we get. And that's important because there was an article in Ground Cover, which you may or may not have seen, showing some research published in Nature by a couple of guys from CSIRO Marine and Atmospheric Research, showing that in April, May, rainfall has declined markedly over the last 10 to 15 years, and it's due to a move in the position of the subtropical ridge. And so our April to May, our traditional main season sowing time, has become much drier, so we need to work out ways of getting around that. And the subtropical ridge moved about 400 kilometres in April, May, has moved. And so to put that into context, that means Birchip's moved to Pooncarie at sowing time. So we have to come up with some strategies in order to get our crops in on time. And in high rainfall environments, early sowing can reduce losses from waterlogging, It also provides a dual purpose option across all rainfall environments. And in theory, slow maturing wheats sown early, or long season wheats, should yield more because they use more water, they grow deeper roots, they have less evaporation, and they put more water through the plant, and they grow more dry matter, but often they grow too much dry matter and they don't have enough water left for grain fill and end up with a poor harvest index. And there's been a couple of published studies, one in the high rainfall zone of Victoria, which have shown that, and another under irrigation at Griffith. But we were interested in what happened in lower rainfall environments as well, lower yielding environments, and if we could manage that harvest index. So the first thing we did when we were setting up this experiment was to identify the optimal flowering window in the 3 environments we were choosing. So we had Lake Bolac in southwest Victoria with Southern Farming Systems, Temora with myself and FarmLink, and Neil was up at Condobolin with New South Wales DPI and Central West Farming Systems. So we used AppSim with a multiplier for heat and frost damage to identify when we should be getting the crops to flower at the different times. And this is what we found. At Lake Bolac, this is the AppSim simulated yield from 120 years of climate data. This is flowering date along the x-axis and yield along the y. The optimal flowering date is around the 20th of October, thereabouts. Around the 25th of October is when you want to be having varieties flowering, and that there is a bit of a yield loss from frost, but frost doesn't really change the optimal sowing date. That was different to Temora, where we should be aiming to have our varieties flowering in the first week of October, and frost does make much more of a difference. So you do have a shift in the optimum due to frost. Same deal at Condobolin, the optimum shifts, and it's around about the 18th of September. So they're the optimal windows that we should be aiming for. And then we looked at how we could take varieties of different maturity and sow them on different dates to get them to flower on that same optimal date. And this is what we came up with for the consistent experiments across those environments. We had 4 main maturity groups and the 5th very fast down here just at one site. And then we had different varieties. So at Lake Bolac we used Forest, but at the other sites we used Eaglehawk, and we could use Lincoln and Bolac at all sites. They're quite well adapted. We were trying to pick well adapted, high yielding AH quality wheats at a minimum for all sites. And at all sites, these were the sowing dates that we had to use in order to get those varieties sown on the same date. So it was consistent across sites that those were the dates we needed to hit the optimal dates, even though the optimal dates changed. So Eaglehawk, sown on the 15th of April, flowers on the same date as Lincoln, sown on the 15th of May in all those environments. So that's the basic experiment we were setting up. But we were also interested to see if we could manage the canopy, the harvest index of the early sown, slow maturing wheats to overcome that problem of developing too much dry matter early on. And so in all the optimal times of sowing, we included at most sites a plant density treatment and sometimes a plant growth regulator or a defoliation treatment. So this is the experiment at Temora in 2011. I guess this is standard practice or pretty close to average industry practice at Temora to sow something like Gregory on the 9th of May or Lincoln into mid-May at those sorts of densities, whereas sowing these slow maturing wheats early is a bit novel, particularly at those low densities. So this is the site at Temora, a picture just to bust up all the graphs. This was the highest yielding treatment, which was Eaglehawk, sown on the 15th of April at 40 plants per metre squared. And you can see that we got a very large yield advantage from sowing a slow maturing variety early and managing for high harvest index. By reducing plant numbers, we were getting an increase in harvest index of the slow maturing varieties. Whereas the faster varieties sown later, we were actually getting a yield penalty from dropping the sowing rate there. So quite a large yield advantage and also a quality advantage. So Eaglehawk and Bolac are both APH quality versus AH for Gregory and Lincoln. So in a reasonably tough year, but with a lot of stored soil water, the slow varieties were certainly much more profitable because of the quality premium and the yield. So the net benefit was over $400 per hectare. just looking at the time of sowing component of that trial, so taking out the management for high harvest index, these are all the varieties sown at 100 plants per metre squared over time. These percentage numbers here are frost-induced sterility at all those times of sowing. So what you can see is that sowing too early, so if we say Ballarat, this is its optimal time of sowing here, it's got 2% frost damage, but when it's sown too early, it's yielding about the same as when it's sown too late, but it's still got 11% frost damage here. So even though you're taking frost, it's still yielding as well as sowing it too late. So in terms of how you time your sowing program, instead of starting at the optimal date and working into suboptimal territory, maybe we should be starting pre-optimal and getting more of that in at an optimal time. And if you look at Gregory, it's a similar story. So this is Gregory's optimal date here with 2% frost damage. Well, only at 2% at the first time of sowing, but yielding as well there. This experiment probably understated the value of slow maturing varieties sown early, in that these treatments, times of sowing, were planted into good moisture from a small April rain. By the time we got to the main season plantings in May, we needed to irrigate to get the crop up. So repeating the experiment nearby in Junee in 2012, probably even a more spectacular result. We're getting a 1.8 tonne or over 2 tonne yield advantage from sowing these Eagle Hawk, the slow maturing variety, early versus the main season varieties sown later. And that was probably driven by the sort of season we had there with a lot of stored soil moisture, but quite a dry growing season and dry spring. The long season varieties had deeper roots, better water extraction at depth, and could hang on a lot longer during grain fill. The gross margin, well, this is the difference between Ballarat, which did make APH 2 versus Lincoln. You're doubling your gross margin, basically, 100% increase. Peter Ridge had a saying, which I've seen quoted: there are only 2 times to sow, on time or early, and I think the Junee data really illustrates that. Again, if we take Ballarat, there's its optimal date. It's yielding more at its pre-optimal date compared to its post. If we look at Gregory, similar deal, there's its pre-optimal date, optimal, post-optimal, so yielding better there. And Lincoln is the extreme example. This is its optimal date here. It yielded better a fortnight or 20 days prior to where people are currently prepared to sow it. And all of these had frost damage. This obviously had a lot of frost damage. But you're basically getting higher yields even though you've got the frost damage there. What about low rainfall environments? So this is the condobolin comparison. The results aren't quite as spectacular, but the slow maturing varieties sown early are yielding at least as well as the faster varieties sown later. And even though these are accumulating more dry matter, their harvest index is still inferior of the later sown things. So you're not picking up such a yield advantage. Condobolin in 2012, similar story, perhaps a bit more of an advantage in this season compared to doing something like this. In the high rainfall zone with southern farming systems, this is 2011. This is Ballarat at the first time of sowing versus Derrimut in the 7th of May versus Lincoln. Ballarat sown early, yielding a tonne per hectare more than Lincoln sown later. And really, in the high rainfall zone, if you want to get close to water limited potential yield, then really we have to start looking at sowing a lot earlier than people currently are. 2012, this is the probably the only data set where sowing earlier than optimal didn't really pay off. So we have Ballarat topping the trial actually at its post-optimal date, so sown in early May as opposed to the end of April, and not doing particularly well from that mid-April sowing, but yields exceptionally good given that there was no rain in November at that site, and again probably reflecting the greater rooting depth. The variety we chose in that environment as the very slow maturing variety, Forest, just seemed to be dud all round at that particular year, and I'm wondering if we picked the right one. It was very newly released at that time. And again, you see sort of the pattern of something like Lincoln coming up like that. Derrimut yielding as well, sown pre to its optimal date as it is to its post-optimal date. Move to Inverleigh, a bit more of a more dramatic effect. Ballarat sown early, certainly dominating everything. But even something like Derrimut, where its optimal sowing date's here, yielding exceptionally well from its pre-optimal date. And I haven't put frost numbers on these, but we are in the process of getting some of them. And of course the point about Ballarat that everyone makes is even though we know it's a high yielding variety, it is perceived to have a screenings problem, but certainly in NVT and also growers themselves, it's hardly ever planted, it's never planted on time basically, it's always flaring too late, and that is really probably what is behind a lot of its screenings problem. So sown early, certainly at Temora in 2012 and late Ballarat, there was no problem with screenings at all as long as it was sown on time, and we'll be getting more data from 2012 as well. So what about the Wimmera and Mallee, where most of the grain is grown in Victoria? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data on this sort of stuff, but BCG did plant a member-funded trial this year in response to the rain in late Feb. They said, well, can we plant winter wheats at that time in response to that? And, you know, we might not get another sowing opportunity till June, and they didn't. And how does that go? So they had 2 long season spring wheats, 2 winter wheats, Rosella and Wedgetail, and the district standard Yitpi, all sown on the 14th of March. There was a defoliation treatment to get the value of a dual purpose option in the 16th of May, and that didn't have an effect on yield. But compared to Yitpi sown in the regular sowing window, so in late May, the yield results were a bit off. So Rosella did the best, and it's probably the winter wheat best adapted to the Mallee. Wedgetail is just a bit too long season. These long season spring wheats just flowered way too fast. They were flowering in June. To sow that early, you need to have a winter wheat. You can't get away with long season spring wheats. Yitpi did surprisingly well being sown at that stage and flowering in June, July and getting spectacularly frosted, but a lot of that came from secondary tillers. But Rosella is probably the sort of type of variety that we don't have in that situation. It's the most adapted to the Mallee, but it's now 27 years old, so it's got a bit of a yield disadvantage against other things. And I guess the other advantage of this strategy is that Rosella produced enough dry matter at that time to sustain 500 DSE days of grazing. So you basically could have had sheep on a paddock of Rosella at 5 DSE from May through to July and not had any yield impact. Is it possible to get that second screen turned off? I don't think it's showing much. And there's just a picture of the trial recovering from defoliation. Okay, so just a quick dip into the physiology of why long season spring wheats sown early do yield more. Basically 3 reasons: deeper roots, less evaporation, and a longer yield building phase, so generating greater grain number. So these are root samples from soil cores taken at Junee in 2012 from Eaglehawk sown on the 18th of April and Lincoln sown on the 17th of May. We're taking cores down to 1.8 metres, and the roots in Eaglehawk were hanging out the bottom of the cores, whereas Lincoln, you struggled to find anything below 1.40 metre. So basically wheat roots grow at 12 millimetres a day from germination to anthesis, and so if you've got a month extra of growing time by sowing that month earlier, you've got about 30 to 40 centimetres of extra rooting depth and access to the water and nutrients in that soil. And you can see that in the water depletion pattern, the water extraction pattern from Junee. This is soil depth, this is depletion in the different varieties. You can see that Eaglehawk and Ballarat were extracting quite decent amounts of water down here, whereas Lincoln couldn't extract any water below 1.40 metre, and the total difference in millimetres was only about 10 millimetres extra in favour of Eaglehawk and Ballarat, but it meant a lot in that spring. And you also get less evaporation by sowing earlier, getting the plants covering the ground earlier. You get more water through the plant and less up to the air. and you can use total dry matter production to estimate evaporation. So you can see that we're getting a higher water use efficiency for dry matter out of the slow maturing varieties sown early because more water is going through the plant. And if you look at and that's because we're getting less evaporation. So around 120, 130 millimetres for the slow maturing varieties versus 150, 160 for the faster ones. So we're increasing water use efficiency to the tune of 20 to 30% for grain. And that's why, because that's what 100 plants per metre squared sown on the 15th of April looks like on the 29th of June versus a May sowing. The other reason is that you have a longer yield formation phase, and by yield formation I'm talking about stem elongation and particularly the end of stem elongation, which is when the spikelet develops, and that determines grain number per spike and also has an effect on grain size. So Eaglehawk has about the same juvenile phase from sowing to Z31 as Lincoln sown later, about the same post-anthesis phase, grain filling phase, but it has a much longer stem elongation phase, which is when the magic happens for yield potential. And growth during that period is very highly correlated to grain yield because it's very highly correlated to grain number. That's from the 3 different environments. And you can see it visually in the crop. This is Eaglehawk sown on the 18th of April, 20 spikelets per head. So we only had about 300 heads per metre squared. There's about 2 grams of grain in each head to give us a 6-tonne yield versus Lincoln, which only had 16 spikelets per head, but about the same head number. Okay, so what does that mean for the whole farm? It means a lot because if you introduce a slow maturing variety into your program, you not only pick up the yield benefit in certain years, but more of your main season crop is going in on time. So we used AppSim to have a look at that. We ran one scenario, which is sort of what happens in southern New South Wales at the moment, where you've got a mid-fast variety like Gregory, and you start sowing on the 5th of May. And these are the average yields that we get employing that strategy. That's the number of yields that we get below 1 tonne per hectare. This second strategy, we said, okay, what happens if we adopt a very slow maturing variety which pushes our sowing date back to the 10th of April, but we're only going to plant it when we have some stored soil water and seedbed moisture, so it comes up when we plant it, because that's what you have to do with slow maturing wheats. And what we found was that we got a very large increase in average farm yield across all environments. Our risk reduced, so we had far less paddocks yielding below 1 tonne per hectare. And the long season variety was actually planted in a surprisingly large number of cases, even in places like the Southern Mallee, where you'd think, well, how often do you get an opportunity to do that? And it turns out it's in about 50% of years, which is quite respectable, and 37% of the total farm area goes to that variety. So this scenario means that you have to have 2 varieties on hand, and you don't know what area of which you'll be sowing until you, as such time as you get a rainfall, but the logistic problems of that are probably more than offset by the increases in yield, average yield that you get. Now, just to sort of explain where that increase comes from, using these data from June E, this is what the sowing time response of Gregory was across that environment, and I was interested to see in the frost and heat section that Gregory is quite frost tolerant and less heat tolerant, and this is Bolac at the same time. So employing the current strategy of sowing a mid to fast variety starting on the 5th of May, you start your 20-day sowing program here and you finish it there, and this line here gives you your average yield, which is 4.7 tonnes per hectare. If you introduce the slow maturing variety Bolac in addition to Gregory, and so this year, say you've got the opportunity to start sowing on the 20th of April, so you start with Bolac and you finish with Gregory, then your average yield comes out at 5.5 tonnes per hectare, because you're getting the advantage from Bolac here and more of this Gregory is going in on time. So putting it into practice, can you actually do that here in Victoria? Well, sort of yes and no. We have a bit of data for southwest Victoria, but for the rest of the state it's a bit lacking. In order to sow early with winter wheats, which you can do from late February into April, we have good adapted varieties in southwest Victoria, some reasonable ones in northeast Vic, but we have no really well adapted varieties in the Wimmera Mallee. Rosella's probably the best we've got, and as I said, that's quite old and has an unusual quality classification. Slow maturing spring wheats, similar story. Southwest Victoria is well looked after with Bolac and Kalelak. Northeast Victoria, probably Bolac and Eaglehawk, reasonable options, but there's no properly evaluated options in Northwest Victoria. NVT's just sown way too late to see how these, and a lot of these slow maturing varieties aren't even included. So there's no way of assessing what their value is. We need some more experimentation. Bolac's probably the best bet, given that it performs exceptionally well from Condobolin right through to Westmere. The very important golden rule for doing this stuff is that if you're going to adopt either of these strategies, you must have some soil water and be sure that the crop's going to come up. You can't sow these dry, because if they come up in June, they will get cooked in the heat. And you can use the very sophisticated moisture probe system of a shovel to ensure that you have 30 centimetres of wet soil, which probably equates to about 25 to 30 millimetres of available water, which should be enough to get you through until winter if you get a false break. Obviously, you don't want to pick paddocks that need a good knockdown for grassweed control. Some diseases are exacerbated by early sowing, so think about the control options there in variety selection. And we've definitely seen an advantage from dropping seeding rates in high-end paddocks if you're sowing early. Just a few case studies which were reasonably successful in southern New South Wales. This is a grower at Illabo, Tony Lehman, planted Bolac on the 15th of April after seeing what we'd been doing at the FarmLink water use efficiency site. He thinks his disc seeder gives him a reduction in vigour, which helps with the harvest index of early sown wheats. Exceptional yield in that year and protein, APH quality, and it won the Journey crop competition to cap it all off. This is going from God's country to the other extreme. This guy farms 35 kilometres west of Mildura in 275 millimetres annual rainfall country. 2010, his consultant suggested, Michael Moody suggested they plant wedgetail in response to that moisture, and it worked exceptionally well. Very little growing season rainfall, but got a fantastic amount of grazing off it during the winter, and at harvest time it yielded at least as well and possibly better as the latest and greatest spring wheats sown later. So even though wedgetail is too long in maturity really for the mallee as far as winter wheats go, it still had very good value. And finally, from the medium rainfall area, David and Charles Kingston at the Rock, Bolac sown on the 20th of April, 4 tonnes per hectare, absolutely no problem with screenings, sown that early. The rest of their main season wheat struggled to do 3 tonnes per hectare, and again they won the district crop competition with that crop. In the Westmere trial, we did have density as a treatment, but basically lowering the density always reduced yields. So I think I had on the graph that, there we go, these are the densities. So this is probably the reason why we got a bit of a dud result at the first time of sowing. We only had 58 plants per metre squared in our high density treatment, which was targeting 160 plants per metre squared. It was a dry seed bed, and that's probably a treatment effect. So yeah, and you can see that by the last sowing date we were sort of up to there, but really at this sowing date we've got an average of 100 plants per metre squared, and it's not really hurting the yields terribly. You're still yielding over 8 tonnes with Bolac at that site.
So James, I'm not going to ask a frost question, but considering this year, what needs to happen between now and April to reduce the risk of sowing, say, Bolac in the southern Mallee? How much rain do we need, and how much water do we need in the profile?
I think you need the top 30 centimetres to be wet. So you'll need greater than a 30 millimetre rainfall event at that time. Where you've got long fallows or vetch hay or pea hay, anything that has a bit of moisture left over from last year, you might need a bit less, but you still need to have seed bed moisture connecting to that deeper moisture. So they'd be far lower risk paddocks to go. But yeah, if you don't get the opportunity, you just don't do it. You just can't do it.
So is that due to, you talked about that root growth of 12 mil a day, so 30 centimetres of moisture would give you 30 days of growth. It's about 12 mil every day.
So are you talking about the other end of the profile?
No, the top profile. So.
Oh, right, to give you about 30 days of.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you don't have that moisture, 30 centimetres, you don't get rain. You're checking that plant.
Yeah, it would be, but it's not going to die. It's very hard to kill juvenile wheat plants. It'd keep them alive until winter. It'd have to be exceptionally dry for them to die at that point, I think. And once they get the rain, they'll be off.
And what happens with root development after flowering?
Nothing.
Nothing. It ceases after that.
Yeah, the plant's putting all its resources into growing, so there's no point in growing roots when you're trying to get all your carbohydrate into the grain.
Oh, James, I just had a question about frost. Does going early and incurring that frost, incurring a little bit of frost damage there in that data, but would that increase the risk of a sort of a massive loss event? I guess is by sowing early, would you increase the chances of a bigger loss at the end of the season? Sort of a
percentage-wise, like you're getting a much bigger. Basically, if you sow earlier, your yield potential's higher, and so if you take the frost damage, you're getting a big percentage reduction, but the yield that you get at the end of the day is as good or better than if you had waited till after the optimal period.
Sorry, just a bit of clarification. Would it increase the likelihood of a more severe event?
You do, yes. Yeah. So, but if you look at, in all of the environments we had, certainly Condobolin and Temora, by the time you get into the end of September, you're still quite frosty, but your chances of a really severe event like a -2 screen temperature have largely fallen away. So you do increase it a bit, but there's also possibly a bit of acclimation working for you as well. And just the yields we've got is the best thing you can go on, I suppose, and we've had quite severe frosts both at Temora, we were in a very low-lying paddock, and at Junee we had 46 frosts for the growing season, and a lot of them in spring. And even though you had frost damage in those early times of sowing, the yields at the end of the day were still as good or better than waiting till after the frost. Basically, frost risk probably isn't best managed by sowing time. You're probably better off managing it with species, so barley or whatever else, hay crops, as Greg Tenney was talking about, and position in the landscape. So, frost tends to repeat itself in those low-lying areas, so avoiding those for early sowing paddocks.